Good evening. I'm your host, Karen Hudis, in this series on the network of global corporate control. Today's segment is pre-recorded. I have said that the world is never going to be the same again because there is a critical mass of people who are seeing clearly the difference between reality and fake news. I made this comment on a story that Russia Today ran about how the Pentagon gave a United Kingdom public relations firm $540 million to fake terrorist videos in Iraq in a secret propaganda campaign. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism originated this story. The network of global corporate control owns the mainstream media and most of the alternative media and tries to censor all the news. Now that my story is out, the censorship is only highlighting their control. Richard Karpinski in 2014 said, quote, "Karen Hudis, the World Bank whistleblower, is still not showing up in the mainstream press. She makes reference to a study of global corporate control which appears in Plus One in 2011. 147 of the 43,000 multinational corporations control 40% of the net worth of companies in world trade and 60% of their annual earnings. This is reported by 3 mathematicians at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. Karen Hudis, World Bank insider, reveals who's behind the throne. The degree of control of the mainstream press in suppressing stories of this magnitude certainly supports the Plus One paper in its conclusion that they constitute a single conglomerate by interlocking boards of directors. She's on Facebook as well as on Google News and in many YouTube videos. This is likely to be a crazy year which could bring the world economy out of the bankster-caused long-term depression or could fail and make things much worse. Let's side with her and improve the whole world." That's the end of Karpinski's quote. This is why only 6% of the people trust the news. People are also aware that governments track what they view on the internet. YouTube is owned by Google, and Google was created by the CIA. Congress overturned President Obama's veto to allow Americans to sue Saudi Arabia over the 9/11 attacks. It's the first time during Obama's presidency that his veto has been overridden by Congress. The Senate rejected the veto 97-1, while the House rejected it 347-77. This means the, quote, Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism Act, close quote, now becomes law. The legislation would allow courts to waive the claim of foreign sovereign immunity after terrorism occurs within United States borders. The bill had passed both in the House and Senate earlier this year, but President Obama had vetoed it earlier this month. The 3 conspirators, American neocons, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, that successfully pulled off the crime of the 21st century, namely the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the United States, are infighting to the point that the layers of secrecy surrounding the 9/11 attacks are beginning to wither away. The weakest link in the triplet of conspirators is Saudi Arabia. That's the country that provided the manpower, finances, and hijacker personnel for the cover story. Quote, Al-Qaeda did it, quote, for 9/11. Stung by U.S. congressional moves to allow families of 9/11 victims to sue Saudi Arabia and calls for the Obama administration to release 28 classified pages in the Joint Congressional Inquiry on 9/11, the intelligence failures, and to release this to the public, the Saudi government is pushing the story that the U.S. government was responsible for carrying out the 9/11 attacks. The first lawsuit has been filed against Saudi Arabia for allegedly providing material support to Osama bin Laden and his team of terrorist hijackers prior to the 9/11 attacks. The filing comes days after the law was passed and the veto was overridden. Stephanie Ross DeSimone was pregnant with Navy Commander Pat Dunn's daughter when he was killed by American Airlines Flight 77, which was deliberately steered into the Pentagon building on the morning of September 11, 2001. Saudi Arabia itself immediately expressed great concern about the overriding the veto, and they warned serious unintended consequences would follow. A Saudi legal scholar, Khatib al-Shamari, who wrote in the London-based Al-Hayat newspaper, is believed to be representing the view of the Saudi government. He stated, September 11th is one of winning cards in the American archives because all the wise people in the world who are experts on American policy and to analyze the images and the videos agree unanimously that what happened in the towers was purely American. That was planned by America and carried out within the United States, and proof of this is the sequence of continuous explosions that dramatically ripped through both buildings. Expert structural engineers demolished them with explosives, while the planes crashing only gave the green light for the detonation. They were not the reason for the collapse, but the U.S. still spreads blame in all directions. And alarmed by the willingness of its regional ally, Saudi Arabia, to question the official version of 9/11, Israel weighed in with New York Democratic Senator Charles Schumer to place a poison pill in the Justice Against Sponsors of Terrorism bill, which cleared the Senate. The bill would allow the families of the victims of foreign government-sponsored terrorism to sue the governments involved for damages, and Schumer placed an amendment inside the JASTA bill that would allow Saudi Arabia to avoid lawsuits so long as the U.S. State and Justice Departments certify to the trial judge that the two departments are making good faith efforts with the defendant country to resolve any issues bilaterally. Schumer's amendment, the stay of actions pending state negotiations, would also allow the state and justice departments to seek from the court continual 188-day stays, killing any lawsuits or just putting them on hold. Israel is also concerned that it too could face lawsuits under the provisions of JASTA. Some of the footnotes in the classified 28 pages in the Joint Congressional Inquiry on 9/11 intelligence failures provide links leading to Israeli involvement in 9/11. It's noteworthy that the Saudis are blaming the George Bush administration for carrying out 9/11 and are leaving Israel out of the equation. Schumer's actions on behalf of the Saudis are a clear indication that the Saudi-Israeli alliance remains intact. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence. Let's start off the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks in New York. The USA was a false flag terrorist attack upon the United States of America concocted by a handful of Israelis and dual passport Americans and carried out by the resources of the Mossad. With Vice President Dick Cheney transferring all operational powers over the police, FBI, CIA, NSA, Secret Service, FEMA, that's the Federal Emergency Management Act, U.S. military over to himself for the day, and there were anti-terrorism drills and exercises with the U.S. military that provided cover for the false flag terrorist attack to go ahead. When Dick Cheney ran those drills, they were exercises at the same time as the real terrorist attacks. This tied up America's resources from fighting back. How September 11, 2001 was carried out and all the main players behind the attack. There are many articles on this, and one article, I made a comment on that, and that was that we absolutely, because of the study of Vitaly Glatfelder and Battiston of the Federal Institute of Technology, we know who the real villain is. That's a network of global corporate control. And I also criticized that article because it said that the immediate future remains unclear, particularly for Western nations, but we have the accurate power transition model that comes from the U.S. National War College, which is telling us what's going to happen. It's telling us about the Coalition for the Rule of Law. And I also said in my comment that we are now witnessing the final days of an empire which will be written about with historical clarity. And I said that the last point, which was that we couldn't figure out how the network of global corporate control could get away with what they did for so long, and why didn't we see it? It's because of the news and journalists. And also that article was also throwing a red herring out. So the alternative media is really no better than the mainstream media. And I also had a comment to somebody who wanted me to friend him on Facebook. He didn't like my comment, and I had said to him that the power transition model that came to the World Bank from the National War College in 2004 is 90 to 95% correct, and that's good enough. And that makes it very likely that the people of the world will succeed in replacing paper currencies with currencies out of gold. And I pointed out one of the indicators that we're on track is because when the representative of the National Guard on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Brigadier General Michael Bobeck, was required to resign, and they said it was because of girlfriend problems, which is just showing that the personnel policies in the Joint Chiefs of Staff are absolutely not working. I said probably the reason for that is because I had been writing to all of the State Adjutants General that they were supposed to do something about the UN troops on American soil, because there's no legitimate government in the United States because the Constitution has been suspended, and therefore there's no way for anybody to give permission to the UN troops. And so I had gotten in touch with Mr. Hervé Ladsou, who's the head of the UN's, could we scroll the teleprompter up? He's the head of the UN's Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and Lieutenant General Maqsood Ahmed, military advisor in the UN's Office of Military Affairs. And I told them that they had to take all of the troops that were seconded on U.S. soil for peacekeeping operations, that they had no permission, and they had to remove those troops. The United States is in interregnum, and there is no legal consent for UN peacekeeping troops on U.S. soil. And so I believe that the National Guard is trying to do something, and that's when they tried to do something, that was the reason for them being dismissed under pretexts. The 9/11 false flag attack has shaken people. There have been a lot of disclosures about the September 11, 2001 attack on the Twin Towers, and I tweeted that this had already, that this was a false flag on the 15th anniversary of the attacks. One of the things that happened in the days preceding the attack was that there was a lot of gold in the basement of the Twin Towers that was removed. Some people say it was 200 million. Some people say it's more than that. There was also silver involved. A team of 30 firefighters and police are helping move the metals, and this can be this was measured, and they said that there were 379,000 ounces of gold and 29,000 ounces of silver. And reports describing the contents of the vaults before the attack were suggesting that nearly $1 billion in precious metals was stored in the vaults. These are resources that are owned by the Global Debt Facility. And the vaults were actually 4 floors beneath the World Trade Center before the attacks. And I had sent an email to the governor of Maryland and also to the Adjutant General of Maryland, Linda Singh, saying that I was informing them that I had advised Hervé Ladsou, head of the UN's Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and Lieutenant General Maksud Ahmed, military advisor in the UN's Office of Military Affairs, to remove any and all troops seconded on U.S. soil for peacekeeping operations. And I also informed Governor Hogan and at the Adjutant General Linda Singh that as the overseer mandate trustee of the Global Debt Facility, I was going to be viewing the assets of the Global Debt Facility on the black screens in Euroclear, but that did not happen because Euroclear refused without my giving them account numbers, their reference. I gave them different account numbers. And what happened just the day before the 9/11 attacks was that there were reports that the Pentagon had lost $2.3 trillion. And this was what Rumsfeld admitted. According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions. That's $8,000 for every man, woman, and child in America. And that admission was one day before the September 11th attacks. That was Rumsfeld was then the Secretary of Defense, and he made that astonishing admission. And months later, the CBS reported this, but it's still posted on the Department of Defense website. On the Public Broadcasting Service, we learned that the $2.3 trillion figure came from a report of the Pentagon's Inspector General. And they said its own auditors admit the military cannot account for 25% of what it spends. And the timing of the admission, just one day before 9/11, kept that story from even making the news at the time. Even when it was finally reported months later, this didn't get very much coverage. On the 10th of September 2011, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld held a press conference to disclose that over $2 trillion in Pentagon funds could not be accounted for. Rumsfeld stated at the time, according to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions. And according to a report by the Inspector General, the Pentagon cannot account for 1/4 of what it spends. Normally, a disclosure like that would have initiated some kind of scandal, but because of the attack on New York and Washington the following day, that meant that the story remained buried. In fact, others go further, and they point to the fact that accountants, bookkeepers, and budget analysts were killed in the Pentagon attack, and suggesting that this, along with the destruction of information, was a possible motive for the attack. Destroying important information that the Pentagon doesn't want the public to find out about, and kill certain personnel who knew or could have found out about it. And that's where the impact of the plane, if it was, or the drone that hit the Pentagon. It was including the Navy Operations Center and the office complex of the National Guard and Army Reserve, and it was also the end of the fiscal year, and important budget information was in the damaged area. Most of those killed in the office called Resource Services, Washington, were civilian accountants, bookkeepers, and budget analysts. They were at their desks when American Airlines Flight 77 struck. One Army office in the Pentagon lost 34 of its 65 employees in the attack. Most of those killed in the office called Resource Services, Washington, were civilian accountants, bookkeepers, and budget analysts. They were at their desks when American Airlines Flight 77 struck. One Army office in the Pentagon lost 34 of its 65 employees. They were at their desks when American Airlines Flight 77 struck. It seems to be the only department which re-entered the building after renovation. Summarizing then, the argument appears to run something like this. Huge sums of defense budget money have gone missing. Simply admitting this was not an option. However, those pulling off the 9/11 inside job decided that if they crashed into just the right spot of the Pentagon, then they could kill many of those who might uncover the problem or tell the public about it, and perhaps also destroy vital documentary evidence. What's more, it gave the opportunity for Rumsfeld to inform the public on September 10th and have his bombshell ignored, courtesy of the attacks on the very next day. There have been a lot of disclosures about the September 11, 2001 attack on the Twin Towers, and I tweeted about that already on the 15th anniversary of the attacks. There are 24 more reasons to doubt the official story of the September 11, 2001. One of those is the absent without leave chain of command. It's well documented that the officials topping the chain of command for response to a domestic attack, they were George Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, Richard Myers, Montague Winfield, Ralph Eberhart, all found reason to do something else during the actual attacks, other than assuming their duties as decision makers. Who was actually in charge? Dick Cheney, Richard Clarke, Norman Mineta, and the 9/11 Commission directly conflict in their accounts of top-level response to the unfolding events. Several or all of them must be lying. There were also air defense failures. The U.S. air defense system failed to follow standard procedures for responding to diverted passenger flights. The timelines, the various responsible agencies, NORAD, FAA, Pentagon, U.S. Air Force, as well as the 9/11 Commission, gave radically different explanations for the failure. In some cases, these failures were upheld for years, such that several officials must have lied, but none were held accountable. Was there an air defense stand-down? How was it possible that the Pentagon was hit 1 hour and 20 minutes after the attacks began? Why was there no response from Andrews Air Force Base, just 10 miles away and home to Air National Guard units that were charged with defending the skies above the nation's capital? How did Hani Hanjour, a man who failed as a Cessna pilot on his first flight in a Boeing, execute a difficult aerobatic maneuver to strike the Pentagon? Why did the attack strike the just renovated side, which was largely empty and opposite from the high command? And in war games, U.S. military and other authorities planned or actually rehearsed defensive response to all elements of the 9/11 scenario during the year prior to the attack, including multiple hijackings, suicide crash bombings, and a strike on the Pentagon. The multiple military war games planned long in advance and held on the morning of September 11th included scenarios of a domestic air crisis, a plane crashing into a government building, and a large-scale bioterrorism emergency in New York. If this was only an incredible series of coincidences, why did the official investigations avoid the issue? There's evidence that the war games created confusion as to whether the unfolding events were real world or exercise. Did war games serve as the cover for air defense sabotage and/or the execution of an inside job? Flight 93, did the Shanksville crash occur at 10:06, according to a seismic report, or 10:03, according to the 9/11 Commission? Does the Commission wish to hide what happened in the last 3 minutes of the flight, and if so, why? Why was Flight 93 shot down, as indicated by the scattering of debris over a trail of several miles? The day there were possible smoking guns. Did cell phones work at 30,000 feet in 2001? How many hijackings were attempted? How many flights were diverted? And their demolition hypothesis. What caused the collapse of a third skyscraper, the WTC-7, which was not hit by a plane? Were the Twin Towers and WTC-7 brought down by explosives? And there's a case for demolitions. The website's WTC7.net and the influential article by physicist Stephen Jones. And there are also other people who have that hypothesis. And there are two reasons for that hypothesis. There were so many lines of evidence which overwhelmingly proved that 9/11 was an inside job that even if one or two theories are disproven, the basic thesis still stands. I want to thank you for listening to another segment of the Network of Global Corporate Control. Today's segment is about the way people are learning to keep their eyes on the ball. This is after $2.3 trillion went missing from the Pentagon's budget, and the investigators were killed by a plane or drone that hit the Pentagon conveniently where the investigators were sitting. The way the National Guard's representative on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Brigadier General Michael Bobeck, was fired after I wrote to all of the State Adjutants General about unauthorized UN troops on U.S. soil. The exposure of rogue elements in the U.S. government after the Twin Towers fell on 9/11 in the crime of the century.